The most unsettling part wasn't the treatment itself, it was how normal it seemed. Women entered clinics seeking relief and left convinced their suffering proved something was wrong with them. Doctors insisted they were helping. Society agreed. And no one asked what consent really meant. Stay, and you'll uncover how Victorian doctors medicalized female emotion, how authority replaced understanding, and why this practice disappeared without ever being openly condemned. If you enjoy this dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reached. In the quiet consulting rooms of Victorian England, behind heavy curtains and polished wooden doors, there existed a medical practice so normalized that few questioned it, yet so unsettling that modern audiences struggle to believe it was ever considered legitimate care. And this practice did not emerge from cruelty or scandal alone, but from a rigid worldview that viewed women's bodies as inherently unstable, their emotions as pathological, and their inner lives as conditions to be managed rather than understood. And in this world, doctors believed they were healers, acting with professionalism and scientific authority, even as they performed treatments that today reveal far more about power, control, and fear than about medicine itself. And to understand how such a practice became routine, one must first understand the Victorian obsession with order, because Victorian society prized restraint above all else, believing that civilization itself depended on suppressing excess, emotion, and unpredictability. And nowhere was this belief enforced more intensely than upon women, whose bodies were viewed as fragile vessels governed by forces men believed could easily spiral out of control. And this belief gave rise to a diagnosis that would dominate female medical care for decades, a diagnosis so vague that it could mean almost anything, and so flexible that it could be applied to almost any woman who failed to conform. And that diagnosis was hysteria, a condition doctors claimed originated in the female body itself, producing symptoms that range from anxiety and restlessness to sadness, irritability, exhaustion, and what they described as nervous agitation. And because these symptoms overlapped with ordinary human emotion, hysteria became a convenient explanation for behaviors society found inconvenient, and once labeled, it required treatment. And the treatment Victorian doctors prescribed was framed as therapeutic relief, delivered clinically, methodically, and without acknowledgement of its deeper implications. And the women subjected to this care were not criminals or outcasts, but wives, daughters, and respectable members of society, seeking help from physicians they trusted, unaware that the framework guiding their care was built not on understanding, but on assumptions about female weakness and male authority, and doctors, trained within the system, believed sincerely that they were restoring balance, relieving pressure, and returning women to proper emotional equilibrium. And because the treatment was medicalized, it was stripped of personal meaning, reduced to a procedure, documented in case notes, discussed in journals, and taught to students as legitimate practice. And this normalization is what makes the story so disturbing, because it demonstrates how easily authority can redefine experience, transforming something deeply personal into something mechanical, something intimate into something clinical, and something human into something managed. And within these rooms, the women who came seeking relief were rarely asked why they felt overwhelmed, isolated, or distressed, because Victorian medicine did not concern itself with emotional context, only with symptom suppression. And in ignoring the social conditions shaping women's lives, doctors instead focused on controlling the body, believing that once the body was regulated, the mind would follow. And this belief allowed a practice to flourish that avoided confronting deeper injustices, such as limited autonomy, restricted opportunity, and constant surveillance of female behavior. And as the practice spread, it became routine, even mundane, recorded without alarm, discussed without shame, and carried out under the guise of professionalism. And yet beneath this calm exterior lay a profound imbalance, because the power to define illness rested entirely with male physicians. While women were positioned as passive recipients of care, their experiences interpreted for them, their sensations reframed as symptoms, and their relief claimed as medical success. And this dynamic created a system where compliance was rewarded, resistance was pathologized, and silence was mistaken for healing. And as the Victorian era progressed, the practice evolved alongside technology, becoming faster, more efficient, and further removed from any acknowledgement of its implications, reinforcing a worldview where women's bodies were sites of intervention rather than sources of agency. And it is here, at the intersection of science, morality, and control, that the true darkness of this history emerges not because of a single act, but because of a system that convinced itself it was helping, while systematically denying women ownership of their own experiences. And as this story unfolds, it becomes clear that what Victorian doctors believed they were curing reveals far more about the fears of their society than about the women who were subjected to its treatments. As the 19th century progressed and industrial cities expanded at a pace no society had prepared for, Victorian medicine found itself overwhelmed not only by physical illness but by emotional distress. It could not explain, and it was in this gap between observation and understanding that one of the strangest medical practices in history quietly took hold, not because doctors sought controversy, but because they believed, quite sincerely, that they were restoring order to bodies they thought were malfunctioning, and the women who entered these clinics were rarely described as ill in the way disease was traditionally understood. Instead, they were labeled as unsettled, overstimulated, fatigued by modern life, or weighed down by nervous tension, a diagnosis that blurred the line between mental strain and physical malfunction. And because Victorian science viewed the body as a system of pressures and releases, physicians concluded that these symptoms resulted from energy that had nowhere to go. An idea that sounds vague today but felt logical in an era obsessed with balance, and this belief allowed doctors to frame their treatments as purely mechanical, a correction rather than an indulgence. And it is crucial to understand that these physicians did not interpret the response they observed as pleasure, because pleasure itself was considered incompatible with respectable womanhood. Instead, they described it as a reflexive release, a bodily reset similar to a muscle relaxing after prolonged tension. And this interpretation allowed the practice to exist openly within respectable medical spaces without scandal, because language shapes reality. And by choosing clinical terminology, doctors insulated themselves from moral scrutiny. And for the women involved, the experience was framed not as choice, but as obligation. A prescribed routine administered under authority, reinforcing the idea that their bodies were not fully their own, but objects to be managed by experts. And this dynamic reveals the deeper discomfort beneath the practice, because it reflected a society deeply uneasy with female autonomy, emotional expression, and unexplained distress, preferring mechanical explanations to confront the possibility that social constraints themselves were the source of suffering. And as demand for this treatment grew, not because of desire, but because of diagnosis, physicians faced an unexpected problem. The procedure was time-consuming and physically tiring for practitioners, leading to frustration rather than enthusiasm. And it was this inconvenience, not moral concern, that drove innovation, prompting the development of early mechanical devices designed to automate the process under the guise of efficiency. And these inventions were introduced as labor-saving tools, praised in medical journals for their practicality, never for the effect they produced. And this normalization further distanced the practice from any acknowledgement of sexuality, embedding it deeper into the medical system, where it remained unquestioned for decades. And what makes this period especially unsettling is how completely the voices of women were excluded from interpretation, because their responses were observed, measured, and documented, but never truly listened to, reduced instead to symptoms that confirmed male theories about the female body. And this reduction transformed lived experience into data, stripping it of meaning while reinforcing existing power structures. And when modern readers recoil at the practice, it is often because they view it through contemporary understanding. Yet the true horror lies not in the act itself, but in the certainty with which it was imposed, the confidence of a system that misunderstood distress so thoroughly that it treated emotional suppression as illness and control as care. And as medical science advanced and psychology emerged as a legitimate field, these practices gradually faded, not because they were denounced as exploitative, but because the diagnosis that justified them quietly disappeared, replaced by new language that reframed women's distress as something more complex than bodily imbalance. And this disappearance is telling, because it reveals how easily a practice can vanish once the story supporting it collapses, leaving behind discomfort rather than accountability. And today, historians look back on this era not to mock its ignorance, but to understand how authority, language, and fear can combine to normalize practices that later generations find disturbing. And in doing so, they uncover a cautionary lesson about the danger of medical certainty divorced from empathy, because when a system refuses to question its assumptions, it can turn misunderstanding into routine, routine into doctrine, and doctrine into something that feels inevitable. And it is this inevitability, quiet, clinical, unquestioned, that makes the story linger long after the practice itself has faded, reminding us that some of history's most unsettling chapters were written not in cruelty, but in confidence.